She stood in her cap and gown, glowing with pride, clutching a degree she'd fought so hard to earn. And then, in front of everyone, he dropped to one knee and asked her to be his forever. She said yes. There were cheers, tears, and the start of a new chapter. But 23 days later, her lifeless body was found in their home. And next to her, a letter no one expected. If you think you know what happened, think again. Stick with us. The real story will leave you speechless. She stood there in her cap and gown, a smile that could light up any room, her eyes sparkling with the kind of hope that comes only from completing a dream. The weight of years of hard work, of struggle, of late-night studying, and of moments that had tested her, all came crashing down in one beautiful moment. On the day of her graduation, surrounded by family and friends, the man she loved, Elijah, took a knee in front of her. "Will you marry me?" he asked. She said yes. And in that very moment, they began a new chapter, one that would forever change their lives. It should have been a day filled with nothing but joy, the beginning of their future together, but what no one saw, what no one could have predicted, was that the story wouldn't end with a wedding. It would end with a tragedy. A tragedy that no one could have prepared for, least of all Jasmine. 3 weeks later, Jasmine was dead, found lifeless in the home she shared with her husband, her body cold, her eyes forever closed. The only clue left behind was a note. A note that, to this day, raises more questions than it answers. The police were called. Elijah, the man who had vowed to love and protect her, found her. And what happened next sent shockwaves through everyone who knew them. Was it truly suicide, as Elijah claimed? Or was there something more to Jasmine's death? Something darker. Something that no one was willing to admit. As the investigation unfolded, the pieces didn't fit. The timeline didn't add up. The questions began to pile up. Who was Jasmine really, behind the perfect graduation photos and the fairy tale proposal? And who was Elijah, the man who had seemingly swept her off her feet, only to be left standing in the ruins of her death? In the coming hours, you'll hear the shocking details of this story, one that no one saw coming, but everyone will remember. We will dive deep into the investigation, through the twists and turns, the lies and the truths, to uncover what really happened in that house. But the question still remains, did Jasmine take her life? Or was it taken from her? Stay with us. What we're about to reveal will change the way you see everything. Jasmine Moore was just 26 years old, but she had already achieved more than many could dream of. She was the first in her family to graduate from college, a nurse with a heart for healing, and a woman with a bright future ahead. Her dreams were finally becoming a reality. She had completed her degree, secured a promising job, and was about to marry the man who had been by her side through it all. At her graduation, the day she had worked so hard for, Elijah Moore, her fiancé, stood there with a smile that made everyone believe in love. He had the charm, the charisma, the kind of presence that made people want to be near him. He was everything Jasmine had ever wanted, successful, confident, and always making her feel special. They were the perfect couple. At least, that's what everyone saw, but Jasmine had been hiding something. Behind her perfect smile and those gleaming graduation photos, there were cracks in the foundation of their relationship that no one knew about. Some whispers had already begun. Some friends had noticed small changes in Jasmine's behavior, the way she had started pulling away, becoming more distant. They had noticed the tension in her voice when she spoke about Elijah, the occasional hesitancy when she talked about their future. But no one ever asked too many questions. After all, they were getting married. Life was moving forward, yet, in those final weeks leading up to the wedding, Jasmine had started to express a certain unease. She began confiding in her best friend that Elijah was controlling. He was always checking her phone, questioning her whereabouts, even scrutinizing the people she spent time with. At first, it seemed like harmless concern from a loving fiancé. But slowly, it turned into something darker. 3 weeks after the proposal, Jasmine was gone. Found lifeless on the bedroom floor, the vibrant woman who had just celebrated the culmination of her dreams was now nothing more than a headline. Elijah, frantic and panicked, made the 911 call. The police arrived at their home to find a scene that didn't quite match Elijah's story that he claimed Jasmine had taken her own life. That's what he told the officers, his voice shaking as he described finding her body. It seemed like a plausible story, an overwhelmed woman, overwhelmed by the weight of life. But something felt off. The first red flag came when they looked closer at the note Jasmine had left behind. The handwriting didn't match her usual style. It wasn't quite her. The words, too cold and mechanical, didn't align with the vibrant, expressive woman Jasmine had been. Some of the phrases seemed oddly detached, almost as if they had been written by someone else. A professional handwriting expert would later confirm it. Jasmine didn't write that note, but the inconsistencies didn't end there. A neighbor who lived across the hall came forward and said she had heard loud arguments coming from their apartment just days before Jasmine's death. Another neighbor reported seeing Elijah leaving the condo late that night, long after he claimed to have returned from work. His alibi was starting to fall apart. The timeline didn't add up. Jasmine had told her best friend just days earlier that she felt trapped. She had said she didn't want to marry Elijah anymore. Was this just a coincidence, or did it mean something more? The detectives dug deeper, following the trail that began to unravel Elijah's perfect image. They discovered that Elijah had been in contact with someone else, a woman named Tiana, whom he had been seeing on the side. Tiana was no stranger to the couple. In fact, she was a friend of Jasmine's. Tiana, who had been close enough to both of them to attend their engagement party, now appeared to be much more than just a friend. Tiana would later admit, in an anonymous interview with the police, that she had been having an affair with Elijah for months. She revealed that their relationship had been serious and that Elijah had promised her a future together. He had convinced Tiana that Jasmine was the problem, that Jasmine was too needy, too controlling. According to Tiana, Elijah had even gone so far as to tell her that he had been planning to leave Jasmine, but the most damning piece of evidence came when detectives reviewed the footage from the building's security cameras. Elijah had claimed to have returned home from work early that afternoon, but the footage showed something different. It showed Elijah leaving their condo, dressed in the same clothes he had worn to work, several hours after he said he'd returned. He wasn't alone. Someone else was with him, walking a few paces behind him in the dark. But the footage cut off before the stranger's face was visible. Who was this person? And why hadn't Elijah mentioned them? As the investigation continued, more and more pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Elijah's own words were being twisted and questioned. His story began to crumble under the weight of the evidence against him. The timeline didn't add up. The alibis were inconsistent. Jasmine's journal, which had been found hidden in a drawer, revealed startling entries from the months leading up to her death. In one entry, she wrote, "I don't know how to get out of this anymore. I feel trapped in my own life. I feel like I'm drowning." She had never shown this side of herself to anyone. Her mother, who had always thought her daughter was happy, was now left grappling with a shocking reality she couldn't understand. She had been proud of Jasmine's achievements, proud of the life she was building. But that life had been torn apart by secrets, lies, and betrayal. The investigation took a darker turn when it was revealed that Elijah had been with another woman when Jasmine's body was discovered. A woman he had been seeing secretly, the same woman who had been helping him cover his tracks. It was all too much to ignore. As the case moved toward trial, the truth began to surface. But even then, the public was divided. Was Elijah truly guilty of what he was accused of, or was there something more to the story? Could Jasmine have truly taken her own life, as Elijah had claimed? Or had he orchestrated her death to escape a life he no longer wanted? The court case that followed was filled with twists, turns, and unexpected moments. Evidence that seemed solid turned out to be circumstantial. Testimonies that seemed truthful began to contradict each other. At the end of the trial, the jury delivered their verdict. Elijah was found guilty of murder, but the question still remained, was Jasmine's death truly an act of revenge, or was it the culmination of a web of lies that had been spun for far too long? And in the aftermath, Jasmine's family, devastated by the loss of their daughter, found a strange kind of peace in the justice that had been served. But that peace was bittersweet. The questions, the unanswered doubts, would never fully disappear. did Elijah kill his wife to be with someone else? Or had the pressures of life led to an irreversible tragedy? And what of Tiana, the woman who had been at the center of it all? Was she just another victim, or was she complicit in the death of Jasmine Moore? What do you think? Do you believe Jasmine's death was a tragic accident or a deliberate act of murder? Could the truth ever truly be uncovered? Stay tuned as we continue to piece together the details of this heart-wrenching case, where nothing is ever as simple as it seems. The trial that followed was nothing short of a spectacle. The courtroom was filled with tension, every eye focused on Elijah, who had once been the picture of charm, now sitting silently as the accusations against him piled up. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man who had grown tired of his wife, tired of the life he had built, and ultimately, ready to end it. The defense, however, tried to convince the jury that Jasmine's death had been nothing more than a tragic accident, a woman overwhelmed by the pressures of life, but the evidence, piece by piece, began to erode that theory. The prosecution had done their homework, and the key to the case was Elijah's past, his relationships, his secrets, and most importantly, his affair with Tiana. It was revealed in court that Elijah had been planning to leave Jasmine for months, but his plan was interrupted when Jasmine found out. What followed was a series of manipulative tactics designed to drive her to despair. Jasmine's journal became one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. The entries painted a picture of a woman who had been struggling with her relationship for months. She wrote of feeling trapped, isolated, and confused. She expressed doubt about the man she had planned to marry, wondering if she could ever escape the controlling grip he had on her. There were moments of hope, dreams of a life outside of her marriage, but they were overshadowed by fear. One entry, in particular, was heart-wrenching. He says he loves me, but I don't feel it anymore. He says he wants the best for me, but I don't feel free. I feel like I'm living someone else's life. Those words, written just days before her death, echoed in the courtroom like a haunting cry. The defense attempted to discredit the journal, suggesting that it was just the ramblings of an emotionally distressed woman. But it was hard to ignore the chilling reality that it mirrored Jasmine's final days, days when she had become increasingly withdrawn, when she had started to confide in friends about her unease and her doubts. The more the prosecution dug into Elijah's life, the more they uncovered about his motives. It turned out that he wasn't just having an affair with Tiana. There were several other women, some casual flings, others more serious relationships, who Elijah had been seeing behind Jasmine's back. His charm had been his weapon, manipulating and deceiving those around him, all while keeping up the image of the perfect husband. But those who knew the real Elijah began to speak out. Former co-workers, ex-girlfriends, even acquaintances, each story seemed to reveal the same pattern: a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, even if it meant destroying the person closest to him. The most devastating blow to Elijah's defense came when forensic experts analyzed the crime scene. Jasmine's body had been found in the couple's bedroom, and the evidence pointed to something far more sinister than a suicide. A thorough examination of the scene revealed no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no signs that Jasmine had fought for her life. But the one detail that sent shockwaves through the courtroom was the lack of any substances that could indicate she had been suicidal. No pills, no alcohol, no signs of a toxic overdose. The autopsy revealed that Jasmine had died from a single, precise injury, an injury consistent with the way a person might die from strangulation. There were bruises on her neck, a clear indication of suffocation. This was not the act of someone ending their own life. This was the act of someone taking it. The timing of her death, just days after she had confronted Elijah about his infidelity, raised further suspicion. It was clear that Jasmine had discovered his secret, and it was clear that she was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. What had been a proposal of love had turned into a dangerous game of control and manipulation. As the evidence mounted, the defense tried to argue that Jasmine had been in a fragile mental state, that she could have taken her life in a moment of emotional distress. But it was hard to ignore the mounting pile of evidence pointing to Elijah. His lies, his alibis that didn't add up, the surveillance footage showing him leaving the house on the night of her death, the damning journal entries, all painted a picture of a man who had used his wife's love as a weapon and ultimately snuffed out her life when she no longer served his needs. The final piece of the puzzle came when Tiana, the other woman, agreed to testify. She had been hesitant at first, unsure of the consequences of speaking out. But as the trial progressed, the weight of her conscience grew too heavy to bear. She came forward and revealed the full extent of her affair with Elijah. She admitted that Elijah had confided in her about his plans to leave Jasmine, that he had spoken openly about wanting to marry her instead. She described how Elijah had become increasingly agitated as Jasmine grew suspicious and how he had expressed his frustration with her, how he had said that she was holding him back from the life he really wanted. In a shocking revelation, Tiana confessed that Elijah had asked her to help him cover up the crime. He had even suggested that Jasmine's death could be staged as a suicide to avoid suspicion. Tiana, overwhelmed with guilt, admitted that she had played a small role in helping Elijah make his story more believable. But in the end, she knew that the truth could no longer stay buried. With Tiana's testimony, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence, the testimony, and the damning facts. Elijah had been caught. There was no doubt in their minds. He was guilty of murder. The verdict was read aloud in the courtroom, and Elijah's face, once so confident and composed, crumbled. The man who had convinced so many of his innocence was now facing the harsh reality of his actions. Jasmine Moore, the woman whose life he had destroyed, was gone, and no amount of manipulation could change that. Elijah was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The jury's decision was met with a mix of relief and sorrow. Jasmine's family, who had been through so much, could finally begin to heal, knowing that justice had been served, but their pain would never go away. They would never see Jasmine walk down the aisle, never see her fulfill her dreams. Tiana, too, was left to grapple with her own guilt. Though she had been complicit in Elijah's lies, her conscience weighed heavily on her. The affair, the secrets, the betrayal, it had all led to one terrible conclusion. She had lost the person she once cared for, and in the end, she was left with nothing but regret. As the years passed, the story of Jasmine Moore and her tragic end continued to haunt those who had known her. The questions remained, lingering in the minds of those who had witnessed the rise and fall of a love that turned into something deadly. Was it truly love that had driven Elijah to murder? Or was it the cold, calculating desire for control and freedom that ultimately led to Jasmine's death? The case may have been closed, but the memory of Jasmine Moore's life, and her untimely death, would never be forgotten. And for those who still remembered her, the haunting question remained: what would her life have been if it hadn't been for the man who promised to love her forever? As the final chapter of the trial drew to a close, a haunting silence descended over the courtroom. The conviction had been handed down, but the emotional weight of the case still lingered heavily in the air. For the Moore family, the victory of seeing justice served did little to heal the deep wound left by Jasmine's death. Her parents, who had watched their daughter blossom into a strong, independent woman, now had to contend with the reality that she was gone forever. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone whose life had been tragically cut short at the hands of the person she had trusted most. But while the courtroom drama had concluded, the ripple effects of Jasmine's murder stretched far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The story of a young woman's dreams crushed by a man who had once promised to love her resonated deeply with those who followed the case, leaving many to ask, how could someone who claimed to love her do this? Elijah's life, once filled with promises of luxury and success, now stood at a precipice. The glitzy facade he had so carefully constructed had crumbled, exposing the dark core of his true nature. A man who had lived a double life, fooling everyone around him, was now facing the consequences of his choices. In prison, he became just another inmate, stripped of his wealth and status. He had no one to turn to. No supporters. No audience. The world that had once been at his feet had abandoned him, and in his isolation, the reality of his actions began to sink in, but Elijah was not one to go down without a fight. He had always been quick with his words, charming in his manipulations, and now, behind bars, he was determined to maintain some shred of his former image. He began to reach out to the media, offering his own version of events. He claimed that he had been wrongfully convicted, that the evidence against him had been fabricated, that his affair with Tiana had nothing to do with Jasmine's death. He even suggested, in a desperate attempt to turn the narrative, that Jasmine had been mentally unstable, that her journal had been manipulated by her family to paint him as the villain. His attempts to rewrite the story fell flat, though. The public, already deeply invested in Jasmine's tragic story, saw through his lies. No one believed him. His name had become synonymous with betrayal, with the cold-blooded murder of the woman he had once promised to cherish. He had been reduced to a cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers of unchecked ambition and toxic relationships. On the outside, Jasmine's family was left to cope with the emotional wreckage left behind. Her mother, who had always been so proud of her daughter's accomplishments, now found herself struggling to make sense of a future without Jasmine in it. She found herself grappling with unanswered questions, wondering what she could have done to help her daughter, to protect her from the man who had destroyed her. Jasmine's best friend, Tasha, struggled with a deep sense of guilt, though she was not to blame for what had happened. Tasha had been the one to encourage Jasmine to speak up, to not ignore the signs, to confront Elijah about his infidelity. She had been there for Jasmine when she had confided in her about the tension in her marriage, about the unease she had felt in those final months. But despite her efforts to offer support, she felt she had failed her friend in the end. She could not protect her from the one person who should have been the safest. Tasha's guilt was compounded by the constant questioning of whether Jasmine had been truly happy. The woman who had stood by her friend through thick and thin, the woman who had seen Jasmine smile and laugh, could not understand how that woman had ended up in a situation where she felt trapped, alone, and ultimately doomed. The woman who had once dreamed of a future with Elijah, a future that seemed so bright, was gone in the blink of an eye. The media frenzy that surrounded the case had all but died down, but the impact of the story continued to reverberate. Jasmine's death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of hidden emotional abuse, of controlling relationships that only came to light after it was too late. Articles, documentaries, and books were written, each one attempting to peel back the layers of Elijah's life and uncover the truth behind Jasmine's tragic end, and then, in a twist that no one could have predicted, a new development came to light. A letter, written by Jasmine herself just weeks before her death, surfaced. It was discovered by a journalist who had been digging into the case, determined to understand the full extent of what had happened. The letter was addressed to Jasmine's parents, and in it, she wrote of her fears of a future she couldn't escape, fears of a marriage she was no longer sure she could continue. She spoke of love, of doubt, and of a growing sense of betrayal. The letter revealed something even more chilling. Jasmine had known, deep down, that her life was at risk. She had written that she was afraid that Elijah would eventually hurt her, that he would find a way to take everything from her, even her life. She had written it in a way that suggested she had come to terms with the reality that the man she had once loved was capable of taking her away from everything she knew. She begged her parents to forgive her if anything happened to her, to remember her as the woman she had been before all the darkness took over. This letter was a turning point for Jasmine's family, but it also reignited the flames of public outrage. How had Elijah been able to get away with his lies for so long? How had he been able to manipulate not just his wife, but an entire community? The resurfacing of Jasmine's letter only deepened the sorrow and anger surrounding her death. It was clear that, even in her final days, Jasmine had been fighting for control, for a way out of the nightmare she had found herself in. As the years went by, the case became a symbol of the complexities of love, trust, and betrayal. Jasmine's story was not just one of tragic loss, but also a story of survival. It highlighted the power of manipulation, the way a person can be made to feel small, insignificant, and dependent on someone they trust. And it served as a stark reminder that even those who seem to have it all, the perfect partner, the perfect life, can be victims of the darkest forces lurking beneath the surface. Elijah's life, however, was now a shadow of its former self. He had no supporters left. No one was fooled by his claims of innocence. And though his voice continued to echo through the prison walls, it would never again hold the power it once had. Jasmine's family, despite their pain, began to heal, knowing that justice had been served. They kept her memory alive, not just through the tears of sorrow, but also through the celebration of her life. The woman she had been before her dreams were stolen by the man she had once trusted. Jasmine's story, the story of a young woman whose life was taken far too soon, remained a sobering reminder of the dangerous consequences of a love that was never truly love. As the years passed, the memory of Jasmine Moore's tragic death never truly faded from the public's consciousness. The media, always hungry for stories of injustice, continued to revisit her case time and time again, searching for any new angles, any fresh revelations. Jasmine's family, though weary from years of grief, allowed these moments of media attention to keep their daughter's name alive, knowing that the world needed to remember what had happened to her and why it mattered. Jasmine's parents became advocates for other women who had experienced emotional and physical abuse, though they never fully healed from the loss of their daughter. They spoke openly about the dangers of toxic relationships, especially those hidden behind a mask of charm and wealth. They visited schools, speaking to young women about the signs of control and manipulation, teaching them the red flags that Jasmine had sadly ignored. The story of Jasmine and Elijah Moore became a cautionary tale, a case study in how the perfect life could mask the darkest of secrets. The police department, too, found itself under scrutiny after the case was closed. Many questions lingered. How had they missed the warning signs? How had they not noticed the subtle clues in Elijah's behavior? How could he have been allowed to manipulate everyone around him for so long? Public sentiment was divided. Some felt that justice had been served, while others believed that more could have been done, especially in the early days of the investigation. For some, the trial had not been enough. They demanded answers about the missteps in the investigation, about what could have been done to prevent Jasmine's death in the first place. A few years after the trial, a new discovery would further shake the already fragile foundations of this case. A cold case detective, reviewing old files for patterns, stumbled upon a crucial piece of evidence that had been overlooked: a series of threatening messages sent to Jasmine from an anonymous number just days before her death. These messages had never been properly investigated. The messages hinted at a deeper layer of betrayal, one that connected Elijah to other unsavory figures. The anonymous person had warned Jasmine to leave her husband, or she would suffer consequences. The messages were cryptic but chilling. It was a stark reminder that Jasmine's fears had been valid all along. The messages sent shockwaves through the investigative community. Questions began to circulate: was there a third party involved? Could Elijah have been acting under pressure or in collaboration with someone else? Was it possible that there had been others, behind the scenes, encouraging him to carry out the crime? This discovery reignited public interest in the case, with many asking for a reopening of the investigation. For Jasmine's family, it was like opening an old wound that could never fully heal. They wondered whether the truth had truly been uncovered or if there were still secrets buried beneath the surface. Was there something more to Jasmine's death than they had been told? This new revelation prompted the police to dig deeper into Elijah's past. As investigators began to look into his financial records and personal connections, they uncovered something disturbing. Elijah had been involved in a number of shady business deals, some of which had ties to organized crime. He had always kept his dealings secret, making sure to distance himself from any public scrutiny, but now, under the weight of these new findings, it became clear that Elijah's life had been far more complicated than anyone had originally suspected. There were whispers that Elijah's wealth had been built on a foundation of corruption. His family business, which appeared legitimate on the surface, had deep roots in shady financial practices, and it was now apparent that he had used his connections to manipulate his way through life. He had surrounded himself with people who weren't afraid to bend or break the law, individuals who had their own reasons for wanting to keep Jasmine quiet. This discovery added a new layer of complexity to the case, and for the first time, people began to wonder if Elijah had been playing a much larger game. Tasha, Jasmine's best friend, found herself conflicted. Over the years, she had done her best to move on, to focus on her own life and career. But the resurfacing of these new developments caused a ripple in her own heart. The guilt that had plagued her since Jasmine's death now returned with renewed force. Had she missed something? Had she failed to see the warning signs? Could she have done more to protect her friend from the man who had ultimately taken her life? As the investigation continued, Tasha found herself once again searching for answers. She began to question everything she had known about Jasmine's marriage, wondering if there had been signs of trouble that she had missed. Jasmine's mother, too, became consumed by the idea that there were still pieces of the puzzle left unexamined. She had always believed that justice had been served with Elijah's conviction, but now, with the new evidence coming to light, she began to wonder if the full truth had ever been revealed. She became determined to uncover every last detail of her daughter's life and death, no matter how painful it might be. For her, the idea of closure seemed almost impossible. There would always be unanswered questions, things she would never fully understand. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in prison, his life now nothing more than a series of empty days. He was no longer the charismatic, well-to-do man he once was. Instead, he was just another convict, serving his time for a crime that had irrevocably changed the course of his life. In his prison letters, he continued to claim his innocence, telling anyone who would listen that he had been wrongfully convicted, that the justice system had failed him. He continued to downplay his role in Jasmine's death, casting doubt on the very evidence that had sealed his fate. But despite his protests, he remained behind bars, his version of events disregarded by those who knew the truth. As the years dragged on, the public's obsession with the case slowly began to fade. But for those closest to Jasmine, the wounds never healed. Her parents continued their advocacy work, hoping to ensure that no other woman would face the same fate. Tasha continued to hold on to the memory of her friend, forever haunted by the smile that would never be seen again. And Elijah? His name had become synonymous with betrayal, with a life of deceit and manipulation, and in the quiet corners of the prison where he spent his days, the weight of his actions was all he could live with now. Jasmine Moore's story, however, was far from over. The investigation into her death had left the world with more questions than answers, and while Elijah had been convicted, the shadow of doubt continued to linger. Was there more to the story than had been revealed? Would the truth ever fully come to light? Only time would tell, but for Jasmine's family and friends, one thing was certain: they would never forget her, and they would never stop seeking justice for the woman who had been taken far too soon. As we come to the end of this heartbreaking story, we still find ourselves asking the same questions. What more is there to the story? Was justice truly served, or are there pieces of this case that are yet to be uncovered? We want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Elijah was the only one involved? Could there be more to this tragedy than we know? Let us know your theories in the comments below. If you want to stay updated on more true crime stories like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Like this video if you believe justice should be served, and share it with others to raise awareness. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes, the truth is just waiting to be uncovered.